G'day and welcome to another episode of Kiwi Car Life. And if like me you love driving, well then you're pretty much guaranteed to love the way a small two-door sports car drives. Why? Well, because at the absolute minimum a car needs 4 wheels, a seat or 2, a steering wheel, 3 pedals and a manual gearbox paired with an engine at the front. And what body style offers all of those features and not much more? Well, of course, a small two-door sports car. It's the very essence of a true driver's car, uncompromised by the need for baby seats in the back, a massive boot for things, a tall ride height for ease of access, and features galore inside that turn a lightweight Integra into a lumbering 2-ton SUV. So now that we've established the appeal of a small two-door sports car, it's time to figure out which one you should buy. And because of course nobody wants an MG or a Fiat or a Kia or a Dodge badge on their small two-door sports car, any reasonable person will be selecting their next weekend toy from one of 2 countries. Yes, of course, the 1940s Axis powers, Japan and Germany. For the last 40 years, these countries have given us an epic array of sports cars that can now be picked up very affordably on the used car market. But which country does it best? To attempt to answer this question, we're going to be pitching my Japanese 2005 Integra Type S that I restored on the channel recently against my German 2007 Audi TT. They're both silver, they both feature manual transmissions and a 2-door liftback body style, and they both cost about the same on the used market. Now, I do acknowledge that these 2 particular cars were in totally different price brackets when new, and they are far from equals in terms of power, which is why we'll be using them as broad representations of Japanese and German sports cars as a whole, rather than looking at the specifics of these 2 exact models. And we begin with the exterior. There's a couple of features that define the outside of Japanese sports cars: simplicity and lightness. Consider this Integra and some of its equivalents from the era like the Celica, the Silvia, the BRZ and the MX-5. The styling is uncluttered by fancy scoops and inlets or overcomplicated headlights. The panels are predominantly steel and plastic to cut costs. The wheels are usually 16 or 17 inches in diameter. The result of all of this simplicity, a timeless design that ages well. A reliable and cheap to maintain car thanks to the small tyres and simple halogen bulbs and a very light curb weight. All of those cars I mentioned before weigh less than 1250 kg, which is a lot lighter than this TT over here. German cars tend to weigh more, in part because they use larger engines, but mostly because there's just more to them. This TT's got adaptive xenon headlights, large 18-inch wheels, parking sensors, a retractable spoiler, pillarless windows. It's just a more complex design. And this causes 3 problems. The first is obviously more weight. This TT weighs 1450 kg versus just 1190 kg for the Integra. The second is a design that often doesn't age so well. The Mark I TT in particular, Mercedes SLK and 986 Boxster were revolutionary at the time and had a lot of cool tech, but today they haven't aged anywhere near as well as the Integra and Silvia. And the third is more expensive maintenance, as now you've got bigger, wider tyres, more sensors, fancier bulbs to replace all over. But there are advantages to all this extra stuff too. They have wider tyres, giving more grip and a better ride. They naturally have more features: headlights that actually light up the road in front of you, parking sensors that make manoeuvring a lot easier, and a leather interior with heated seats. Clever stuff that does add weight, but it makes a car like this much nicer to live with. This theme carries over to the suspension and the brakes. German cars often have massive multi-piston front calipers and slotted, drilled and ventilated front rotors, whereas Japanese cars tend to just have tiny little single piston calipers with plain old steel rotors. As a result, every single Japanese car I've taken on track has encountered brake fade within 2 or 3 laps, whereas my German cars, despite weighing more, have been able to go all day long without issue. German cars also tend to use more premium materials like aluminium in the suspension components, reducing unsprung mass. However, suspension geometry is definitely in Japan's favour, as most Japanese sports cars use double wishbone suspension that perfectly keeps the tyre in contact with the road, whereas a lot of German sports cars tend to use strut suspension that lifts the inside of the tyre as the car leans over. Inside, the main difference is the level of features. The Japanese think that if you're buying a sports car, that means you just want to drive and don't want any features that add weight or complexity. The result is that Japanese sports cars are awesome to drive because they're so light, but they're also a nuisance to live with because they're equipped like a Turkish urinal. Leather interior, heated seats, electric seats, auto lights, auto wipers, 6 CD changer, cruise control, multifunction steering wheel, comprehensive trip computer, adaptive suspension, stability control, active aero, all-wheel drive, and a 4-star safety rating are all features this Integra doesn't have, but the TT does. Now, this does mean that the TT is 260 kilograms heavier than this Integra, but it's also much nicer to live with every day. German cars also are designed to be driven at high speed, so they tend to have a lot more sound deadening in them too. The engines, though, are probably the biggest difference between the German and Japanese manufacturers, and the main reason for this is their country's regulations. In Japan, cars are taxed based on displacement and weight. All cars have to be electronically limited to 180 kilometers an hour, and their roads are narrow and windy with low speed limits. Because heavy, large displacement cars are expensive to register, and their roads favour cars with less power, Japanese sports cars tend to use really highly strung sub-2 litre 4-cylinder engines, like the K20A, F20C, SR20, FA20, 2ZZ, and 3SGE. All of those engines rev to over 7,500 RPM and make more than 100 horsepower per litre. In Germany, on the other hand, cars are taxed based on CO2 emissions, not displacement. They are limited to 250 kilometers an hour, not just 180, and their roads are long, straight and wide, where on the Autobahn at least you can go as fast as you want. Therefore, German manufacturers tend to use more torquey 6-cylinder engines with enough grunt to comfortably sit at 250 kilometers an hour without breaking a sweat. As a result, while the Boxster, the TT and the Z4's 6-cylinder engines sit at the bottom of the list when comparing power per litre with the Japanese cars, they sit right at the top of the list when comparing torque per litre. German engines are designed for effortless performance and a more exotic sound rather than to fit into a displacement-based tax bracket. In terms of reliability, someone made a comment on my channel recently which I think sums things up perfectly. Japan builds cars for humans. Germans build cars for Germans. Because I've maintained all of my German cars like German, none have given me any trouble. And in fact today, brands like BMW, Audi and Porsche are right up there with Honda and Mazda on consumer reliability reports, and it's all of the American brands that are right at the bottom. But back in the early 2000s, many German brands were known for fairly catastrophic issues. Audi and BMW, for instance, really struggled to make 4- and 8-cylinder engines that didn't burn away all their oil and eat their own timing chains. But fortunately, most of those engines that were known for problems aren't fitted to the sports cars that we're discussing today. The Boxster's flat sixes can have bore score and IMS bearing issues, but they're exceedingly rare. The Z4's straight sixes can leak oil and have water pump failures, and the TT's VR6s can have timing chain issues, but often not until really high Ks, and there's usually warning signs when the timing chain is on its way out. Japanese 4-cylinders, on the other hand, tend to just work. Some burn oil, some have a few sensors or solenoids that can fail, and many wear out CVs, engine mounts, and particularly gearbox synchros. But all of that should be expected as part of maintaining any car. In general, I would say if you buy a naturally aspirated German or Japanese sports car and maintain it well, you're pretty unlikely to have any major issues. All of these things come together to produce vastly different driving experiences. Let's go through the parameters of the driving dynamics of each of these cars to see how they differ. Starting with torque. Because Japanese sports cars use highly strung 2-litre engines, if you get the revs up, they go just fine. But put your foot down in 5th gear at 1200 RPM up a hill, and nothing happens. If anything, we're getting slower. Whereas if we switch to my TT, 1200 RPM, 5th gear, foot down, and it pulls very smoothly and quite happily up this hill, no problem, thanks to all that extra torque. German cars also have the power advantage, simply because they have larger engines with more cylinders. But I still maintain it's more impressive to get a lot of power from a really small engine rather than just using the American method of dumping in a really big lazy engine to make lots of power. So even though the German cars are more powerful and they sound more exotic, I would say that it's actually the Japanese engines that are more rewarding to drive when you wind them out. Another significant advantage with Japanese sports cars is the throttle response. German sports cars use e-throttles, which are okay, but they're not as good nor as linear as a good old-fashioned Japanese cable throttle. In general, Japanese sports cars tend to have shorter gears because they don't need to be geared to sit at really high speed like the German cars. These K-Series Hondas in particular have the gear ratios absolutely perfect, where the revs barely drop 2000 RPM after each gear change, meaning the engine stays in VTEC and you get to enjoy 2 or 3 gear changes before breaking the speed limit. That said, the German brands do know that short gears make a car more fun, and so the TT and Z4 in particular are fitted with significantly shorter final drives than the cars with which they're based, resulting in most Japanese and German sports cars having pretty similar gear ratios. So the ratios are a tie, but the Japanese definitely have better feeling transmissions. For some reason, the German manuals always seem to have really long throws and very plasticky, rubbery sensations to them, whereas the Japanese cars have a really nice, short, clinical throw. But where the German sports cars absolutely crush the Japanese sports cars is with their automatic transmissions. Now, personally, I believe buying an automatic sports car is a cardinal sin, but if you don't feel like changing your own gears, well then the German 6-speed dual clutch or ZF6 will be far superior to the 4 and 5-speed slush boxes found in Japanese sports cars. The only semi-decent Japanese automatic I've discovered is in the BRZ. Handling, I would say, has to go to the Japanese sports cars, simply because they weigh less, they usually come with LSDs, and they usually have double wishbone suspension. Plus, they often have hydraulic power steering that communicates a lot better than the German EPS units. Down a twisting back road like this, you can just push a Japanese car to the absolute limit and it just takes it. German cars do definitely handle well, particularly the Boxer. That is just a masterful car to drive. And their increased power allows them to catch up again on the straights, where 160 horsepower is just not quite cutting the mustard in this Integra. But in terms of raw nimbleness, you just cannot beat a lightweight Japanese sports car down a twisting New Zealand back road like this. And finally, which ones are more fun? Well, I think the best way I can summarize this is that the Japanese sports cars hit the extremes. Get them singing to over 7,000 RPM like that, and they are just an absolute blast. They'll put a massive smile on your face with their incredible engines, unbelievable nimbleness through corners, and totally connected driving experience. But try driving one for any reasonable length of time and the revs sitting at over 3,000 RPM, the total lack of features on the inside, the noisy, uncomfortable cabin, and crashy ride quality will drive you nuts. The German cars are arguably not as fun and aren't quite as connected to drive. This TT in particular is a little bit more soft. The clutch and e-throttle are slightly more annoying to use. The steering is a little bit more vague, and because it's four-wheel drive, it just means it's not quite as exciting to drive. It feels like a surgical instrument rather than a horse with some mustard stuck up its bottom. But crucially, it makes up for all that by delivering a sensational driving experience in all areas, not just down a twisting back road like this. It's not quite as nimble or connected as the Integra, but it makes a far more exotic noise. The power is just that much more accessible, and you don't have to work anywhere near as hard to get it. And when you're done with all the fun and games, it settles down to become a perfectly usable GT car despite its small size. And so to conclude, of all the parameters that we have compared today, the Japanese sports cars have a simpler and more timeless design, they're cheaper to maintain and slightly more reliable, they're lighter and more nimble through the corners with better steering feedback, They have more impressive engines with better throttle response, they have better feeling transmissions, and on the right road they are a little bit more fun. German cars, on the other hand, use more premium materials throughout. They offer a lot more features inside, they're much quieter and more comfortable to travel longer distances in, they have a more exotic sound with more power and torque under your right foot, they have similarly short gear ratios in the manuals but far superior automatics, they tend to be more stable at speed, and finally, German cars are a lot cheaper. You can pick up a manual TT 3.2 like this for under 10 grand, and a manual 3-litre Z4 or 2.7-litre Boxster for under 20. Integras, Celicas and MX-5s are still relatively affordable, but MR2s, S2000s, 370Zs and Silvias are far from cheap, especially for what you get. Because I like cars that are good value for money, that offer a fun driving experience, but still with a few creature comforts, I tend to gravitate towards European sports cars. But I'm certainly not denying the fact that Japanese sports cars I've owned and driven in the past have been awesome in their own right. So, what are you choosing? The TT, Z4 or Boxster, or the Integra, Prelude, S2000, Celica, MR2, GT86, Silvia, 370Z, MX-5 or RX-8? Let me know down in the comments and I look forward to seeing you again next time.